The gunshots that ricocheted through Willow Creek that fateful morning in 1875 changed Grace Hampton's life forever, transforming her from a respected schoolteacher to a woman on the run with nothing but the clothes on her back and a locket containing her late mother's portrait. The dust of the Arizona Territory road clung to her skirts as she trudged forward, each step taking her farther from the home she'd known for the past 3 years. Behind her lay accusations of theft she couldn't disprove. Ahead lay uncertainty that terrified her more than the posse she was certain would soon be following. Grace had never imagined herself in such circumstances. The daughter of a preacher from Boston, she'd come west with dreams of bringing education to frontier children. Now, at 24, those dreams lay shattered like the window of the schoolhouse when the banker's son had broken in and stolen the town's tax collection, a crime for which she was being blamed. The merciless sun beat down on her fair skin as she staggered along. Her water canteen had emptied hours ago, and the distant shimmer of what might be a ranch house wavered on the horizon like a mirage. Grace blinked, wondering if her dehydrated mind was playing tricks. But as she drew closer, the weathered wooden structure became more distinct, along with a corral housing several horses and a barn that had seen better days. She hesitated at the property line, marked by a crooked fence post bearing a weathered sign, Trailwind Ranch. Taking a deep breath, Grace steeled herself and approached the main house. She'd barely reached the porch steps when the door swung open, revealing a tall man with a shotgun loosely aimed in her direction. "State your business," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. Grace raised her hands instinctively. "Please, sir, I'm just seeking water and perhaps work if you have any." The man lowered his weapon slightly, studying her with piercing blue eyes that stood out against his sun-darkened skin. He couldn't be much older than 30, she guessed, noting the absence of gray in his sandy brown hair that curled slightly beneath a well-worn Stetson. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and the sleeves of his cotton shirt were rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "You look half dead," he observed bluntly. "Water's at the pump, help yourself." He gestured toward the side of the house with the barrel of his gun. Grace nearly wept with relief. "Thank you, sir." She hurried to the water pump and worked the handle with trembling arms until cool water splashed into the waiting trough. She cupped her hands and drank greedily, not caring about the impropriety of it all. When she'd had her fill, she straightened and found the man watching her from the porch steps, his shotgun now resting against his shoulder. "You mentioned work," he said. "What can you do?" "I was a schoolteacher," she replied honestly, "but I can cook, clean and I learn quickly." His eyebrow rose skeptically. "A schoolteacher, out here alone," Grace hesitated, knowing the wrong words could send her back into the unforgiving desert. "Circumstances changed, I need to move on." He seemed to consider this, his gaze traveling over her disheveled appearance. "I'm Yates Tucker," he finally said. "This is my spread." "Grace Hampton," she replied, offering a small curtsy out of habit, then feeling foolish for it. The faintest hint of amusement crossed his features. "Well, Miss Hampton, my housekeeper left 2 weeks ago to get married. Place has gone to hell since. I can offer room and board plus $2 a week for cooking and keeping things tidy. It wasn't much, but it was shelter and safety. I accept, Mr. Tucker. Folks call me Yates." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Kitchen's through there. Might want to get dinner started before the hands come in. They get ornery when they're hungry." Grace nodded and climbed the steps, painfully aware of her appearance and the close proximity of this intimidating man as she passed him. The interior of the ranch house was spacious but Spartan, with minimal furnishings and a layer of dust on nearly every surface. The kitchen, however, was surprisingly well equipped, with a cast iron stove, a solid wooden table, and ample shelving stocked with provisions. "Bedrooms upstairs, last door on the left," Yates called from the main room. "Previous housekeeper's things are still in there if anything fits you." Grace felt a flush creep up her neck at the thought of wearing another woman's clothing, but practicality overrode her sense of propriety. Her own dress was filthy and torn from her flight. "Thank you," she replied, then added hesitantly, "Mr. Tucker Yates, I should tell you that I may have people looking for me." He paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Most folks out here are running from something, Miss Hampton. As long as you're not bringing trouble to my door, your business is your own." With that, he left her to her new duties, the door closing behind him with a decisive thud that somehow felt like both a threat and a promise. Grace stood in the center of the kitchen, taking stock of her surroundings and her situation. She was alone, a stranger had given her shelter, and she was a wanted woman. Swallowing hard, she rolled up her sleeves and set to work. Whatever came next, she would face it with the dignity her father had instilled in her. By the time the ranch hands arrived for supper, Grace had managed a hearty beef stew, fresh biscuits, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She'd also found time to change into a simple calico dress left by her predecessor, a bit loose in the bodice, but otherwise serviceable, and to splash water on her face and hands, pinning her dark blonde hair into a more presentable arrangement. 5 men filed into the dining room, their conversation dying as they spotted her. They ranged in age from a young man barely out of boyhood to a grizzled older fellow with a magnificent white mustache. "Boys, this is Grace Hampton," Yates announced from the doorway. "She's taking over for Mrs. Perkins." The men mumbled greetings, awkwardly removing their hats as they took their places at the table. "That there is Quinn," Yates continued, pointing to the oldest man. "Foreman, then we got Riley, Mac, Billy, and the kid there is Jasper." Grace nodded to each man in turn. "Pleased to meet you all. I hope you'll find the meal satisfactory." "Smells better than anything we've had since Mrs. Perkins left," Jasper blurted, earning chuckles from the others. Dinner proceeded with minimal conversation, the men too focused on eating to engage in much talk. Grace remained standing, serving and refilling coffee cups when needed. When the meal concluded, they thanked her with surprising politeness before filing out to the bunkhouse, leaving her alone with Yates. "You did well," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They're decent men, but they've been living on their own cooking too long." "Thank you for the opportunity," Grace replied, gathering plates. "I'm used to earning my keep." Yates looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his features. "Then keep my heart too," he said quietly. Grace froze, a plate in each hand, and stared at him. Had she heard correctly, the corner of his mouth quirked up. "That's what my father said to my mother when she came to work here 30 years ago. She was a runaway too." He stood and stretched. "Good night, Miss Hampton. I rise at dawn." With that, he left her standing speechless in the kitchen, wondering what kind of man she had agreed to work for and whether she had just jumped from danger into something equally unpredictable. The next few days established a routine. Grace rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent mornings cleaning and organizing the neglected house, made lunch for whoever was around, then prepared a hearty dinner for the evening when all hands returned. She worked tirelessly, partly out of gratitude and partly out of fear that idleness might lead her thoughts back to Willow Creek and the trouble that had driven her away. Yates was an enigma. He spent most days working alongside his men, returning sweaty and dusty, but always with a nod of acknowledgement for Grace. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but seemed to observe everything. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find his gaze on her, thoughtful and assessing, before he turned away. By the end of her first week, Grace had transformed the main house. Floors were scrubbed, windows sparkled, and she'd even found time to mend various items of clothing the men had shyly presented to her. She was hanging freshly laundered sheets on the line behind the house when Yates approached, leading his horse. "Taking a ride to town," he announced. "Need anything?" Grace hesitated. "Perhaps some thread, if it's not too much trouble, and any news you might hear," he nodded, understanding her unspoken concern. "I'll keep my ears open. Town's a good 20 miles off, so I won't be back until tomorrow." "Be safe," she said automatically, then blushed at her presumption. Something like surprise crossed his face before he tipped his hat and mounted his horse. "Don't wait up," he called over his shoulder as he rode away. With Yates gone, the ranch seemed different somehow. The men took their meals in the bunkhouse that evening, sparing Grace the need to prepare a formal dinner. Instead, she used the time to explore more of the house, eventually finding herself in what appeared to be Yates's study. She knew she shouldn't pry, but curiosity got the better of her. The room was neat, but lived in, with a desk covered in ledgers and papers. A bookshelf held an impressive collection of volumes ranging from practical ranching guides to classic literature. Grace ran her fingers along the spines, surprised to find dog-eared copies of Shakespeare and Dickens among them. A framed photograph on the desk caught her attention. It showed a younger Yates standing beside an older couple, his parents, she presumed. They looked happy, the woman's hand resting on Yates's arm with obvious pride. Grace smiled at the image, trying to reconcile it with the taciturn man she knew. Snooping already? Grace whirled around, heart pounding, to find Quinn standing in the doorway, his weathered face neutral. "I was just—" she began, but words failed her. "Curious about the boss," Quinn supplied, not unkindly. "Can't blame you, he's not one for sharing." Grace replaced the photograph carefully. "I shouldn't have intruded." "No harm done." Quinn leaned against the doorframe. "Figured you might have questions. Most do when they first meet Yates." "He mentioned his parents," Grace ventured. "His mother worked here," Quinn nodded. "Margaret was a runaway from an arranged marriage, arrived here half dead, much like yourself. Old man Tucker took her in, fell hard for her. Built all this up together." He gestured around them. "She passed 5 years back, cancer. Tucker Sr. followed 6 months after. Folks said it was a broken heart. And Yates took over," Grace concluded. "Been running things ever since. Does a fine job too, though he works himself too hard." Quinn studied her. "You should know, Miss Hampton, Yates went to town partly on your account." Grace felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Word travels, even out here. "Something about a schoolteacher accused of theft in Willow Creek. Yates wanted to hear for himself what they're saying." Her hands trembled. "I didn't do it." "Figured as much," Quinn said calmly. "Yates did too, I reckon, or he'd have never let you stay." "What will he do if there's a reward?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. Quinn's bushy eyebrows rose. "Yates Tucker ain't the type to sell out a woman for money, Miss Hampton. His daddy raised him better than that." He tipped his hat. "Good night, madam. Don't worry yourself too much." After Quinn left, Grace returned to her room, sleep eluding her despite her exhaustion. What would Yates discover in town? Would he return with a sheriff in tow? The night stretched endlessly as she imagined every possible outcome. Dawn was breaking when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Grace hurried to her window to see Yates dismounting, his movements slow with fatigue. She quickly dressed and descended to the kitchen, brewing coffee and starting breakfast. By the time he entered through the back door, she had a steaming cup waiting. Yates accepted it wordlessly, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. He looked tired, dust coating his clothes and dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd ridden through the night. "You're back early," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady as she continued preparing breakfast. "Wanted to beat the heat," he replied, watching her over the rim of his cup. "There's talk in town about a schoolteacher." Grace's hands stilled on the skillet. "I see. They are saying she stole the town's tax money, $500. His voice revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Sheriffs put out notices, there's a reward." Grace turned to face him, chin raised despite the fear coursing through her. "I didn't take that money, Mr. Tucker. I know." His simple statement caught her off guard. "How could you possibly know that?" Yates set his cup down and leaned forward. "Because I've watched you, Grace Hampton. You mend the men's clothes without being asked. You save the best cuts of meat for others and take the scraps for yourself. You work from sunrise to well past sunset without complaint." His eyes held hers. "That's not the character of a thief." Relief made her knees weak, and she gripped the edge of the stove to steady herself. "Thank you for believing me." "Tell me what happened," he said, not a demand but a request, so she did. How the banker's son, frustrated by her rejection of his advances, had broken into the schoolhouse where the town's money was temporarily stored during the bank's renovation. How he'd planted her handkerchief at the scene. How his father, the most powerful man in Willow Creek, had backed his son's story. "I ran because no one would believe my word against theirs," she concluded. "I had no family there, no connections." Yates listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he nodded once. "The banker's name?" Hargrove, Samuel Hargrove. His son is Philip. I know of them, Yates said, his tone hardening slightly. Hargrove has investments throughout the territory, including the saloon in our town. Will you turn me in? Grace asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Yates stood, his height imposing in the small kitchen. No, Grace, you're safe here. He moved toward the door, then paused. But this isn't over. Truth has a way of coming to light sooner or later. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her to wonder exactly what he meant and what he might be planning. Life at Trailwind Ranch continued in its rhythmic way through the heat of summer. Grace found herself settling into the role of housekeeper with increasing comfort, and gradually the men began to treat her less like a fragile newcomer and more like a fixture of their daily lives. Billy asked her to read letters from his sweetheart in Kansas. Jasper, the youngest, sought her advice on how to approach a girl he'd met in town. Even Quinn, usually reserved, occasionally shared stories of his years on the frontier. Yates remained somewhat apart, though Grace noticed small changes in his behavior. He began lingering after meals, sometimes discussing books they'd both read or asking about her life before Willow Creek. He brought her wildflowers once, casually setting the small bunch on the kitchen table with a mumbled comment about how they were just growing by the creek anyway. As August ripened into September, a letter arrived that threw the peaceful routine into disarray. Grace was kneading bread dough when Jasper burst into the kitchen, waving an envelope. Mail delivery came through, he announced. Got something for the boss. Yates, who had been reviewing ledgers at the kitchen table, accepted the letter with a raised eyebrow. Rare to get correspondence out here, he commented. Breaking the seal, Grace watched surreptitiously as he read, noting how his expression darkened with each passing moment. Finally, he folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Everything all right, she ventured when he remained silent. Yates's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. Samuel Hargrove is buying up water rights along the Little Tedges River, trying to force out smaller ranchers. He glanced at her. Same man who accused you of theft. Grace wiped flour from her hands. What does that mean for Trailwind? Means I need to ride to Santa Fe, meet with other ranchers. Quinn, he called, and the foreman appeared moments later as if he'd been waiting just outside. Gather the men, we need to talk. For the next hour, the kitchen became a war room of sorts. Maps were spread across the table, water sources discussed, legal rights debated. Grace served coffee and listened, understanding enough to know that Hargrove's actions threatened not just Trailwind but several neighboring properties as well. We leave tomorrow, Yates finally announced. Quinn, you'll stay behind with Mac to watch the place. The rest ride with me. How long will you be gone? Grace asked, trying to mask her concern. Hard to say. A week, maybe 2. Yates met her gaze directly. Will you be all right here? There was something in his question that went beyond practical concerns, a note of personal care that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. Of course, she assured him. I've grown quite comfortable at Trailwind. Later that night, after the men had retired to prepare for their journey, Yates sought her out on the porch where she sat enjoying the evening coolness. There's something I didn't mention earlier, he said without preamble, settling into the chair beside hers. Hargrove will be at this meeting in Santa Fe. He's making his case to the territorial authorities. Grace tensed. I see. I won't bring up your situation, Yates continued, but I'll be watching him, taking his measure. Men like that usually have more than one scheme going. Be careful, Grace said softly. The Hargroves have influence. Yates turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the window. Are you worried about me, Grace Hampton? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had voiced. I worry about anyone confronting the Hargroves, she replied carefully. Just anyone. His voice had dropped lower, intimate in the darkness. Grace's pulse quickened. No, she admitted. Not just anyone. Yates shifted, his hand moving to cover hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. I'll be back, he promised. And when I return, perhaps we might talk about arrangements. Arrangements, Grace echoed, barely trusting her voice. He squeezed her hand lightly. About your position here, about the future. Before she could respond, he stood, towering above her in the shadows. "Good night, Grace," he said softly, then disappeared into the house, leaving her with a racing heart and a mind full of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. The ranch felt eerily quiet after Yates, and most of the hands departed the next morning. Grace found herself checking the horizon throughout the day, a habit that Quinn noticed but kindly didn't mention. The days stretched into a week, each one increasing her worry despite Quinn's assurances that such business often took time. It was during the 9th day of Yates's absence that trouble arrived at Trailwind. Grace was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching, too many for just Yates and the men returning. She shaded her eyes against the sun to see 5 riders approaching, none of them familiar. Quinn emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, positioning himself between Grace and the newcomers. Mac appeared moments later, similarly armed. "Get inside, Miss Hampton," Quinn ordered quietly. "Lock the door." Grace hesitated, reluctant to leave the men facing unknown visitors alone. "Go," Quinn insisted. "If it's trouble, Yates would want you safe." Mention of Yates spurred her to action. She hurried inside, securing the door behind her but moving immediately to the window where she could observe what transpired. The riders reined in before Quinn, dust billowing around their horses. The leader, a man with a flashy vest and an oiled mustache, removed his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Afternoon," he called. "Looking for Yates Tucker." "He ain't here," Quinn replied flatly. "State your business." "Name's Jenkins. I represent Mr. Samuel Hargrove." The man smiled, revealing gold teeth. "We understand Tucker's been having some financial difficulties. Mr. Hargrove is prepared to make a generous offer for this property." Grace's blood ran cold at the name Hargrove. She pressed closer to the window, straining to hear. Quinn's posture remained rigid. "Mr. Tucker ain't selling, and he ain't having financial difficulties." Jenkins sighed theatrically. "Now, that's not what our sources tell us. Way we hear it, Trailwind Ranch is one bad season away from foreclosure." "Your sources are wrong," Quinn stated. "Now you've delivered your message. Best be on your way." One of the other riders moved his horse forward slightly. "Might be better to reconsider, old man. Accidents happen on isolated properties like this." Mac raised his rifle slightly. "Might be better for you boys to ride out while you still can." Tension crackled in the air as both sides assessed each other. Finally, Jenkins replaced his hat. "We'll return when Tucker's here. Tell him to expect us, and to consider Mr. Hargrove's generosity while he can still benefit from it." With that, they wheeled their horses and rode away, dust swirling in their wake. Grace unlocked the door and hurried outside. "Are they truly gone?" Quinn lowered his rifle, eyes still tracking the departing riders. "For now, but they'll be back." "Is it true about the ranch's finances?" Grace asked hesitantly. Quinn's expression was grim. "Last season was hard. Drought killed off more cattle than we could afford. Yates has been working to recover, but—" he shrugged. "It ain't as dire as they made out, but it ain't good either." "And now Hargrove wants the land," Grace mused, pieces falling into place. "He accused me of theft, and now he's pressuring Yates." "Different schemes, same snake," Mac muttered. Quinn rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Miss Hampton, might be best if you stayed out of sight for a while. If those men come back and recognize you from Willow Creek." Grace nodded, understanding the implications. "Of course, but Quinn, Yates needs to know about this visit." "I'll send Mac to Santa Fe tomorrow," Quinn decided. "Yates needs to come home." That night, Grace struggled to sleep, worried about both the threat to Trailwind and Yates's safety. Would Hargrove connect her presence here to his son's crime in Willow Creek? Would he use that knowledge against Yates somehow? She had just drifted into an uneasy slumber when a sound jolted her awake, the distinctive crack of a rifle shot. Grace bolted upright, heart pounding. More shots followed, accompanied by shouts and the terrifying orange glow of fire visible through her window. Grabbing a shawl, Grace rushed downstairs to find Quinn loading a shotgun in the main room. "Stay inside," he ordered when he saw her. "Raiders set fire to the barn." "Who are they?" she gasped. "Hargrove's men, I'd wager," Quinn growled, moving faster than I expected. The front door burst open and Max staggered in, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Got 2 of them," he panted. "But there's at least 6 more. They're trying to drive off the horses." Quinn cursed. "Can you shoot?" Mac nodded grimly, accepting the rifle Quinn thrust toward him. "What about me?" Grace asked. "I can help." Both men looked at her in surprise. "My father believed women should know how to defend themselves," she explained quickly. "I can shoot a rifle." Quinn hesitated only a moment before nodding toward a cabinet. "Carbines in there. Ammunition box on the shelf. But you stay in here, you hear? Shoot anything that comes through that door that ain't us." Before she could respond, both men disappeared into the night, leaving Grace to retrieve the weapon with trembling hands. She checked it as her father had taught her, making sure it was loaded before positioning herself where she could see both the front door and the main window. The night became a chaos of gunfire, shouts, and the terrible sound of frightened animals. Through the window, Grace could see the barn fully engulfed in flames now, the fire casting demonic shadows across the yard. She glimpsed men moving in the darkness, exchanging gunfire with Quinn and Mac, who had taken positions behind the water trough and a woodpile. A sudden movement at the side of the house caught her attention, a shadow passing by the kitchen window. Grace swallowed hard, adjusting her grip on the carbine as she moved quietly toward the back door. Someone was trying to enter the house from the rear while Quinn and Mac were occupied in front. The kitchen door handle turned slowly. Grace raised the rifle, aiming at the center of the door, her finger tense on the trigger. The door swung open to reveal a man with a bandana pulled up over his nose, a pistol in his hand. "Stop right there," Grace commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The intruder froze momentarily, then laughed. "Well, looky here, the little lady thinks she's Annie Oakley." "I will shoot you," Grace warned, the carbine unwavering. He took a step forward. "No, you won't." "Women don't have the stomach for." The report of the rifle cut off his words as Grace fired, the bullet striking the doorframe inches from his head. The man yelped and ducked back outside. "Next one goes between your eyes," Grace called after him, quickly working the lever to chamber another round. A commotion from the front of the house drew her attention, more gunfire, followed by the thundering of hooves and shouts that sounded different from before. Keeping the rifle ready, Grace moved cautiously toward the front room, wondering if more raiders had arrived. The front door flew open, and she raised the carbine only to lower it immediately at the sight of Yates standing there, his face streaked with soot and his expression fierce. "Grace," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Yates," she gasped, the rifle clattering to the floor as she rushed toward him. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. His arms enfolded her immediately, strong and secure. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, holding her at arm's length to examine her. "No, I'm fine," she assured him. "Quinn and Mac, they're all right. My men arrived in time." Yates's eyes were hard as flint. "We caught 4 of them. Hargroves hired guns, just as Quinn suspected." "How did you know to come back?" Grace asked. "Intuition," Yates replied grimly. Something felt wrong at that meeting. Hargrove was too confident, too unconcerned about losing the water rights case when I realized he might have another plan. He trailed off, his hands tightening on her shoulders. "I shouldn't have left you here." "You couldn't have known," Grace said softly. Their eyes held for a long moment, the house quiet around them despite the commotion still happening outside. Then, with a groan of what sounded like surrender, Yates pulled her against him once more and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, as if he expected her to pull away. But Grace responded immediately, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as the terror of the night transformed into an entirely different kind of intensity. Yates deepened the kiss, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back, holding her firmly against him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you arrived," he confessed. "I wouldn't have objected," Grace whispered, a smile tugging at her lips despite the circumstances. Their moment was interrupted by Quinn clearing his throat from the doorway. "Sorry to intrude," he said, not looking particularly sorry, "but we've got prisoners to deal with and the barn's still burning." Reality crashed back. Yates straightened, though he kept one arm around Grace's waist. "Any casualties?" "None on our side," Quinn reported. 2 of theirs wounded, not serious, lost the barn and some feed, but we got all the horses out." Yates nodded. "Keep the prisoners secured. I'll ride for the marshal at first light." His gaze returned to Grace. "This ends now." Hargrove's gone too far. The night that followed was long and busy. Everyone worked to ensure the fire didn't spread to other buildings, tending to the horses now corralled in the pasture and keeping watch over the captured raiders. Grace made coffee and bandaged minor injuries, working alongside Yates and his men until dawn broke over the smoking ruins of the barn. True to his word, Yates departed for the town of Copper Springs as soon as there was light enough to ride safely, promising to return with the territorial marshal. Before he left, he pulled Grace aside. "Stay inside today," he instructed. "If Hargrove learns his men failed, he might send others." "I'm not afraid," Grace told him. Though it wasn't entirely true, Yates cupped her cheek, his expression softening. "I know you're not." "That's why I'm afraid for you." He leaned in to place a quick kiss on her forehead. "We'll talk when I return, about everything." Grace watched him ride away, hope and fear warring within her. Everything had changed last night: the attack, the kiss, the promise of a conversation about their future. Yet looming over it all was the shadow of Samuel Hargrove and the accusations that had driven her from Willow Creek. Yates returned late that afternoon with Marshal Edwards, a grizzled lawman with a no-nonsense demeanor who interviewed each of the captured men separately. By sunset, he had what he needed: sworn statements that Samuel Hargrove had hired them to burn out Trailwind Ranch and drive off the livestock, hoping to force Yates to sell the property. "This is enough to arrest Hargrove," the marshal announced, "but it gets better." He gestured to one of the prisoners, a weaselly man with nervous eyes. "This one's feeling especially talkative. Says Hargrove's been running multiple schemes across the territory, including having his son steal money in Willow Creek and frame the schoolteacher." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Yates moved to her side immediately, his arm encircling her shoulders. "Seems young Philip Hargrove bragged about it to the wrong people," Edwards continued. "This fella heard it directly. Said the boy was mad because the teacher spurned him, so his pa helped him get revenge and pocket some cash in the process." "Will you arrest Philip too?" Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. The marshal nodded. "Both Hargroves, madam. I'll be riding to Willow Creek after I deliver these miscreants to Copper Springs." He studied her thoughtfully. "I take it you're the schoolteacher in question?" Grace straightened. "I am, Grace Hampton." "Well, Miss Hampton, I'd appreciate if you'd come to Willow Creek in a week's time to make a formal statement. Should clear your name officially." Edwards tipped his hat. "Of course, given the circumstances, I understand if you prefer to stay here." The meaningful glance he cast between Grace and Yates made it clear he had observed their closeness. Grace felt her cheeks warm but didn't move away from Yates's embrace. After the marshal and his prisoners departed, an unusual quiet settled over Trailwind. The hands busied themselves with securing the property and beginning to clear the barn debris, while Grace prepared a simple supper. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Yates's gaze following her, as if he feared she might disappear. When the meal was finished and the men had retreated tactfully to the bunkhouse, Yates found her on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. "You're free to go back now," he said quietly, leaning against the railing beside her. "Your name will be cleared. You could teach again." Grace turned to study his profile, strong and handsome in the fading light. "Is that what you want, for me to leave?" "No," the word came out roughly. He faced her fully then, his eyes intense. "I want you to stay, Grace, not as my housekeeper," her heart quickened. "As what then?" Yates took her hands in his. "As my wife, if you'll have me." The directness of his proposal took her breath away, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Yates Tucker was not a man who dealt in half measures or uncertainties. "We barely know each other," she said softly, though her fingers tightened around his. "I know enough," he countered. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you work hard and expect little in return. I know when you smile, the whole room gets brighter." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "And I know that when I thought those raiders might hurt you, I've never been more terrified in my life." Grace stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "And what do you know of my feelings?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. I hope they mirror my own, but if they don't, she silenced him with a finger to his lips. They do, she whispered. They have for some time now. Relief washed over his face, followed by a joy so pure it transformed his usually stern countenance. Then say yes, he urged, drawing her into his arms. Yes, Grace breathed against his lips before they met hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Copper Springs, Quinn standing as Yates's best man and the pastor's wife attending Grace. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with the ranch hands and a few neighboring families in attendance. Grace wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Yates had ordered specially from Santa Fe, insisting it matched her eyes. True to the marshal's word, both Samuel and Philip Hargrove were arrested and subsequently convicted, the father for fraud and attempted arson, the son for theft and false accusation. The town of Willow Creek sent Grace a formal apology along with an offer to resume her teaching position, which she politely declined. Life at Trailwind Ranch transformed with Grace as its mistress rather than its housekeeper. A new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, sturdier and larger. The main house bloomed with feminine touches, curtains at the windows, wildflowers in jars, and eventually the sound of a baby's laughter. Their firstborn, a daughter they named Margaret after Yates's mother, arrived exactly a year after their wedding. She had her father's determined chin and her mother's gentle eyes. When Yates first held her, his hands trembling slightly with the newness of fatherhood, he looked at Grace with wonder. "I never thought I could love anyone as much as I love you," he murmured. "But now." Grace smiled tiredly from the bed. "She's perfect, isn't she? Just like her mother," Yates agreed, carefully returning the infant to Grace's arms. He sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting protectively over both his wife and daughter. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Grace asked, adjusting the blanket around Margaret's tiny form. "For stumbling onto my property that day. For staying. For this family we're building." Yates's voice roughened with emotion. "I thought I knew what it meant to have a home before, but I was wrong." Grace reached up to touch his face, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "I'm the one who should be grateful. You took in a desperate stranger, believed in me when no one else would. Best decision I ever made," Yates declared, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Though I reckon it wasn't really a decision at all. The moment you said you were used to earning your keep, I was already halfway in love with you. And when you told me to keep your heart too." "I meant every word," he assured her, bending to kiss her forehead and then the downy head of their daughter. "And I always will." As the years passed, Trailwind Ranch flourished under their joint stewardship. Grace started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching in a room Yates added to the main house. 2 sons followed, Margaret, Thomas, and James, both with their father's skill with horses and their mother's love of books. The legend of how Grace Hampton came to be Grace Tucker became a favorite story in the territory, growing more romantic with each telling. Some versions claimed Yates had fought a dozen men single-handedly to rescue her from pursuers. Others insisted Grace had saved Trailwind from financial ruin with a hidden fortune. The truth, as Yates often remarked to their children, was both simpler and more miraculous. "Your mother showed up on my doorstep one day," he would say, winking at Grace across the dinner table, "and I was smart enough not to let her leave." On their 20th anniversary, Yates presented Grace with a small silver locket to replace the one she had carried from her mother. Inside, he had placed a tiny portrait of their family on one side and on the other, a scrap of paper bearing the words that had changed their lives. "I'm used to earning my keep / then keep my heart too." "You've kept it safe all these years," he told her as they stood on the porch of the home they had built together, watching their children tending to the horses in the corral. Grace leaned against her husband, as much in love with him now as she had been that night on this same porch when he first kissed her. "And I always will," she promised, her heart full with the knowledge that what had begun as desperate flight had led her not just to safety, but to the deepest happiness she had ever known. In the distance, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. Another day was ending at Trailwind Ranch, but for Yates and Grace Tucker, the greatest adventure of their lives loving each other continued on, as enduring as the land that had brought them together.